man sits propped against a tree on SAIPAN, July 7, 1944. Blood soaks through the field dressings wrapped around his body. Wounds from a grenade that tore through his abdomen, shrapnel embedded in his thigh, his back shredded by machine gun fire. Sergeant Thomas Baker, who has already destroyed 4 Japanese pillboxes single-handedly with a bazooka, refuses evacuation. "Just prop me up against that tree," he tells his brothers. "Give me my pistol and 8 rounds. They don't want to leave him. Orders are orders." When they return the next morning, they find 13 dead Japanese soldiers arranged in a semicircle around Baker's body. His pistol lies empty in his hand. Every one of those 8 bullets found its mark. This is how Marines died in the Pacific. This is the price they paid for victory. Between 1942 and 1944, the United States Marine Corps fought its way across thousands of miles of hostile Pacific Ocean, seizing strategic islands from an enemy that had sworn never to surrender. These weren't battles in the European sense. Massive tank formations clashing across open terrain, or infantry divisions grinding forward through French villages. Pacific warfare was something else entirely, something more intimate and more terrible. It was fighting in pitch darkness through jungle so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face, hearing the enemy's voices but not knowing if they were 10 feet away or 100. It was wading ashore under withering fire, watching the man next to you simply cease to exist as a shell found him. It was the heat that made men hallucinate, the coral that shredded flesh like broken glass, the caves that had to be cleared one by one with flamethrowers and grenades. It was an enemy who considered surrender worse than death, who would feign surrender and then detonate grenades, who would charge into certain death because their code of Bushido demanded it. The Japanese Empire in 1942 controlled an area larger than anything in human history. From the borders of India to the Central Pacific, from the Aleutian Islands to the approaches of Australia, the rising sun flew over conquered territory. The Japanese military, hardened by years of warfare in China, convinced of their racial and spiritual superiority, trained to consider death in battle the highest honor, seemed unstoppable. They had destroyed the American battleship fleet at Pearl Harbor. They had humiliated British forces at Singapore. They had driven American and Filipino forces from the Philippines in the war's most devastating defeat. General Douglas MacArthur had fled under cover of darkness, promising, "I shall return." But in the summer of 1942, that promise seemed hollow. The United States Marine Corps in 1942 was not the massive, technologically advanced force it would become. These were men who had trained in the peacetime corps of the 1930s, when budgets were tight and equipment scarce. Many had enlisted to escape the Depression, seeking steady meals and a paycheck. They drilled with wooden rifles because the Corps couldn't afford enough real ones. They practiced amphibious landings in the Carolinas, but nobody really knew if the tactics would work. The pre-war Marine Corps numbered barely 20,000 men. By 1945, it would grow to nearly 500,000, but in those early days, it was a small band of professionals and volunteers about to face a test unlike anything American forces had encountered. The 5 battles examined here represent not just military engagements but transformations of tactics, of men, of the entire nature of warfare in the Pacific. At Tenaru, the Marines learned that the Japanese would literally rather die than retreat, that charges supposedly abandoned by modern armies would come screaming out of the darkness with sword-wielding officers leading men who believed their emperor was a living god. At EDSON'S Ridge, they discovered that holding ground against suicidal night attacks required a kind of courage that transcended normal human endurance. At Bougainville, they saw one man's willingness to charge into certain death could save thousands of his brothers. At SAIPAN, they witnessed the horrifying reality that Japanese civilians would throw themselves from cliffs rather than accept American occupation. And at PELELIU, they learned that the Japanese were adapting, that the enemy was learning from defeat and creating defensive systems so sophisticated that every yard of advance would cost blood. These battles share common elements. None offered the glory of conventional warfare where armies meet on open ground and the better general wins. Instead, these were desperate, close-quarters struggles where the difference between life and death came down to who reacted faster when a grenade landed in a foxhole, who kept their head when Japanese soldiers materialized from the darkness screaming, "Banzai." They were battles where 19-year-old privates made decisions that determined the outcome, where Navy corpsmen risked their lives a dozen times a day to drag wounded men to safety, where company commanders watched their units shrink from 250 men to 50 in a matter of hours. They were battles where heat and thirst and disease killed as surely as bullets, where the jungle itself seemed like an enemy, where men developed infections from coral cuts that wouldn't heal for months. The strategic context matters. Japan's war plan assumed that Americans were soft, that they lacked the warrior spirit necessary for the kind of brutal warfare that the Pacific would demand. They believed Americans would negotiate rather than pay the price for absolute victory. Every island the Marines took proved that assumption catastrophically wrong. Guadalcanal, where both Tenaru and EDSON'S Ridge were fought, was Japan's first major attempt to reverse American gains. Its loss forced them onto the defensive. Bougainville threatened their major base at Rabaul. SAIPAN brought American bombers within range of the Japanese homeland for the first time. PELELIU, controversially, may have been unnecessary, but it demonstrated that the closer the Marines got to Japan, the more fanatically the enemy would fight. The Imperial Japanese military was not a mindless horde of fanatics, though American propaganda sometimes portrayed them that way. They were professional soldiers, many with combat experience in China dating back to the early 1930s. Their marksmanship was excellent. Their jungle warfare skills, developed in Malaya and Burma, were superior to American capabilities in 1942. Their light machine guns, the Type 99, were reliable and deadly. Their artillery, when they had it, was used with skill. Their officers were trained at military academies where they studied the same military theorists Americans did: Clausewitz, Jomini, Mahan. What made them different was Bushido, the warrior code that dominated their military culture. Death in battle was not just acceptable. It was glorious. Capture was unspeakable shame, not just for the soldier but for his family. This wasn't rhetoric, they believed it absolutely. It meant they would fight from positions long after Western armies would have surrendered. It meant wounded Japanese soldiers would detonate grenades rather than accept medical treatment. It meant that clearing a cave might require killing every single defender because they simply would not stop fighting. The weapons of Pacific warfare deserve attention because they shaped how battles were fought. The Marine infantryman's primary weapon was the M1 Garand rifle, 8 rounds of .30-06 ammunition in an internal magazine, semi-automatic fire, accurate and reliable. It gave Marines a crucial advantage over Japanese soldiers armed with the Type 99 Arisaka, a bolt-action rifle that required manual cycling between shots. The Browning automatic rifle, the BAR, provided squad-level firepower, a 20-round magazine capable of automatic fire, though its weight, nearly 20 pounds loaded, made it a burden in the Pacific heat. The .30 caliber machine gun, water-cooled and crew-served, could fire for hours without overheating and became the anchor of defensive positions. The Marines had the M1 Thompson submachine gun for close-quarters work, though its .45 caliber rounds were heavy and soldiers could only carry limited ammunition. For support, they had 60mm mortars that could be carried by infantry and 81mm mortars that provided heavier firepower. Artillery was crucial: 75mm pack howitzers, 105mm howitzers, and when available 155mm guns that could obliterate Japanese positions. The Japanese countered with their own weapons. The Nambu Type 99 light machine gun was lighter than American equivalents and easier to move, though less reliable in the mud and sand of jungle warfare. Their Type 92 heavy machine gun, called the Woodpecker by Americans for its distinctive sound, was exceptionally accurate and well-made. They had knee mortars, the Type 89 grenade discharger, which despite its name wasn't fired from the knee but was light enough for one man to carry and operate. Their artillery, when present, was skillfully employed. Their soldiers carried grenades, and their officers carried swords, not ceremonial but actual fighting weapons they would use in Banzai charges. Most terrifying was their willingness to turn themselves into weapons, to conduct human wave attacks where casualties of 70% or 80% were acceptable if the objective might be taken. Amphibious warfare, the Marine Corps' specialty, was still being invented as these battles were fought. The Higgins boat, the LCVP, landing craft, vehicle, personnel, could carry 36 men and deposit them directly onto a beach. The larger LCM, landing craft, mechanized, could transport vehicles and heavy equipment. The Amtrak, the LVT, landing vehicle, tracked, could actually cross reefs and travel inland, though its armor was minimal and its crew exposed. These vessels turned every beach landing into a terrifying experience. Men packed shoulder to shoulder, unable to see what awaited them, feeling the boat's engine vibrations through their boots, hearing the coxswain's shouts but not understanding the orders over the engine noise. Then the ramp would drop and the world would explode. Machine gun fire kicking up geysers in the water, artillery shells landing among the landing craft, the horrible necessity of running forward into the fire because staying in the boat meant certain death. Men learned to scramble over the sides rather than exit through the ramp, which Japanese gunners had pre-sighted. They learned to keep moving no matter what because the beach was a kill zone and the only safety lay in moving forward fast enough to overwhelm the defenders. The Pacific Island geography dictated tactics. Guadalcanal featured coastal plains where Henderson Field could be built, but the interior was dense jungle cut by rivers and ridges. Bougainville's coast was swamp, then jungle so thick that maintaining contact with units 50 yards away was nearly impossible. SAIPAN had cane fields that provided concealment but also limited visibility to feet, and cliffs where the final tragedy of civilian mass suicide would unfold. PELELIU was different. Coral limestone that formed natural fortifications, ridges honeycombed with caves that connected through underground passages, volcanic rock that amplified heat until men collapsed from heatstroke while fighting. The jungle wasn't romantic. It was a place where rain could turn ground to mud in minutes, where leeches attached themselves by the dozens, where mosquitoes carried malaria and dengue fever, where fungal infections turned feet into raw meat, where simple cuts became infected and refused to heal. Men fought in this environment for days, weeks, sometimes months without relief, sleeping in muddy foxholes, eating cold rations, never truly dry, never truly clean, always exhausted. Now, with this context established, we turn to the battles themselves. 5 separate actions that collectively defined Marine Corps courage and demonstrated the terrible price of victory in the Pacific War. The night of August 20, 1942, on Guadalcanal is alive with sound. Insects create a constant buzz and chirp. Unseen birds call from the darkness. The Ilu River, Americans mistakenly call it the Tenaru, flows toward the ocean with a soft rushing sound. Private John Harding, 19 years old and 5 months out of basic training, lies in his foxhole near the riverbank. He's from Iowa, where the loudest sounds at night were whined through cornfields and the occasional passing car. Here, every sound could be the enemy. The Marine defensive line forms an L shape along the river and the beach, anchored by artillery pieces sited on the sandspit where the river meets the ocean. They've been told the Japanese are coming. The question is when. 3 days earlier, on August 17th, Captain Charles Brush led a patrol eastward from the Marine perimeter. Brush, a lean 32-year-old from Oregon, had earned his commission through OCS and was leading Company A of the 1st Marines. His orders were reconnaissance, find out what Japanese forces were operating in the area. For miles east of Henderson Field, in thick jungle near Coley Point, his patrol made contact. Not a small patrol, a force of about 200 Japanese soldiers. The firefight was sharp and one-sided. Brush's Marines held the high ground and had superiority in automatic weapons. When it ended, 31 Japanese lay dead. But the intelligence Brush brought back was more valuable than the enemy casualties. Among the dead Japanese officers, Marines found maps showing the planned route of attack on Henderson Field, operational orders, and most crucially, information indicating a much larger force was approaching. The commanding officer who received this intelligence was Colonel Clifton Cates, leading the 1st Marine Regiment. Cates understood immediately what it meant. The Japanese weren't probing, they were coming in strength with the objective of retaking Henderson Field, the airstrip that gave Americans control of the air over Guadalcanal. Without that airfield, American forces couldn't hold the island. Cates positioned his forces accordingly, reinforcing the eastern approaches with Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines. Machine gun positions were sited to create interlocking fields of fire. Artillery coordinates were plotted for every likely avenue of approach. Marines dug deeper foxholes and strung barbed wire where it was available. They waited. Unknown to the Americans, Colonel Kaineo Ichuki was at that moment leading 917 men of the 28th Infantry Regiment toward the Marine positions. Ichuki, 44 years old, was a veteran of the war in China and a true believer in Bushido. He had complete confidence in the superiority of Japanese arms and Japanese spirit. The tactical situation meant nothing to him, that the Marines knew he was coming, that they held prepared positions, that they had artillery support. What mattered was Japanese fighting spirit versus American weakness. His plan was simple to the point of absurdity. He would march his regiment directly at the American positions, cross the river, and conduct a night assault with cold steel. His men would charge with fixed bayonets, samurai swords for the officers, absolute commitment to break through or die trying. This wasn't recklessness, this was doctrine. The Japanese military taught that violent assault conducted with complete disregard for casualties would break any enemy's will to fight. It had worked against Chinese forces. It would work against Americans. What Ichuki didn't know was that he was leading his men into one of the most devastating ambushes of the Pacific War. And before his attack even began, the Marines would receive one more piece of crucial intelligence, delivered by a man who should have been dead. Sergeant Major Jacob Vouza of the British Solomon Islands Protectorate Defense Force was a scout working with the Americans. On August 20th, while moving through the jungle, Japanese troops captured him. They found a small American flag in his pocket. Vouza had been given it by American Marines and carried it as a symbol of his loyalty to the Allied cause. For this, the Japanese decided he was a spy. They tied him to a tree. Then they began to torture him, demanding information about American positions, troop strength, artillery placements. They beat him with rifle butts. They stabbed him repeatedly with bayonets. They cut him. When he refused to speak, they stabbed him through the throat and left him to die. Vouza didn't die. After his captors left, he worked himself free of the ropes. This took hours with bayonet wounds in his chest, arms, and throat. Then he began to crawl. The Marine lines were miles away through jungle. He crawled, pulling himself forward with his hands, leaving a trail of blood. He passed out from blood loss and woke and continued. Took him the entire night. At dawn on August 21st, American sentries heard something moving in the bush. They challenged. A voice answered, weak, barely intelligible, speaking English. They found Vouza collapsed just outside the wire, nearly dead from blood loss and shock. They carried him to the aid station. The doctors didn't believe he would survive. He had 7 major bayonet wounds, had lost massive amounts of blood, and had a wound through his throat that should have been fatal. But before he lost consciousness, Vouza managed to speak. He told them the Japanese were coming. He described their strength, about 1,000 men. He pointed in the direction they would attack. He had watched them crossing a river to the east. They were close and they would attack soon. Then he finally allowed himself to pass out. The doctors worked to save his life and miraculously he would survive. But the information he provided in those final moments of consciousness would save hundreds of American lives and help ensure the coming battle's outcome. Colonel Cates positioned his forces with Vouza's information. The main defensive line would be held by Lieutenant Colonel Pollock's 2nd Battalion. Machine gun positions were placed in depth, positioned so that if one was knocked out, others could cover its field of fire. The sandspit where the Ilu River met the ocean, the Marines called it Hell's Point, was the obvious avenue of approach, and Cates made sure it was covered by at least 4 machine gun positions and had artillery pre-plotted to plaster the area on command. Company G was placed along the east bank of the river. Company E was in reserve, ready to counterattack or reinforce. The 75mm and 105mm artillery pieces were sighted and ready. Ammunition was distributed. Every Marine received extra bandoliers of .30-06 rounds for their Garens, extra magazines for the bars, boxes of linked ammunition for the machine guns. Nobody was going to run dry during this fight. Night falls on August 21st, and the Marines wait. Private Harding in his foxhole near the river can hear his own heartbeat. He checks his rifle for the 10th time, magazine seated, round in the chamber, safety on. The jungle is completely dark. No moon, just the faint stars visible through breaks in the canopy. Time passes with painful slowness. Midnight comes and goes. Then, around 0130 hours, the Japanese arrive. They don't come silently. The first sound is singing, Japanese soldiers singing military songs as they march toward the American positions. Then voices shouting in English. "Marines, you die! Blood for the Emperor! Banzai!" The psychological warfare is intended to unnerve the Americans, to make them afraid before the attack even begins. Instead, it tells every Marine exactly where the enemy is. Machine gunners tighten their grips on the trigger handles. Riflemen nestle the stocks of their garrons into their shoulders. Artillery forward observers whisper coordinates into field telephones. Then the Japanese charge. They come in waves, hundreds of men running across the sandspit, bayonets fixed, officers waving swords, all of them screaming. The Marines wait 3 seconds, 2 seconds, 1 second, then every weapon opens fire simultaneously. The sound is cataclysmic. Machine guns hammer out long bursts, tracers showing red arcs across the darkness. Rifles crack in rapid semi-automatic fire. The 37mm anti-tank guns, loaded with canister shot, fire point-blank into the charging enemy. Artillery shells begin landing among the attackers, massive explosions that throw bodies into the air. The Japanese keep coming. Men fall by the dozens, but the survivors run over the bodies and continue forward. Some reach the barbed wire and die there, caught on the wire and cut down. A few actually reach the Marine positions and bayonet fighting begins, but these are isolated incidents. The overwhelming firepower of the American defensive line is simply too much. Private Harding fires his Garand as fast as he can pull the trigger. 8 rounds gone in seconds. The distinctive ping as the empty clip ejects. Another clip loaded and 8 more rounds fired. He can see figures in the darkness, shadows that become men who become bodies. There's no time to think, no time to process what's happening. Training takes over. Aim, fire, reload, aim, fire, reload. His rifle becomes too hot to touch the barrel. Around him, other Marines are doing the same. The machine gunners are firing in long, continuous bursts, the water jackets on the guns actually steaming from the heat. Ammunition bearers are running forward with more belts because the guns are consuming ammunition at an incredible rate. Colonel Ichuki himself leads one of the charges. He's 50 yards from the Marine lines when a burst of machine gun fire cuts him down. His death doesn't stop the attacks. Japanese officers continue to lead men forward. Some wade into the river trying to cross and flank the Marine position, but they're shot down in the water. Bodies begin to pile up on the sandspit, literally pile up, stacks of dead and wounded 2 and 3 deep. The wounded don't call for help. They lie still or they pull grenades and wait for Americans to approach. This is Bushido, no surrender, no retreat, death in battle the only acceptable end. The attacks continue through the night. Wave after wave comes across the sandspit, and wave after wave is destroyed. The Marines are almost out of ammunition when dawn begins to break. The Japanese make one final charge in the growing light, and this one actually breaks through the American line at one point. Hand-to-hand fighting erupts. Marines use rifle butts, bayonets, knives. A Japanese officer with a samurai sword cuts down 2 Marines before he's shot. The breakthrough is contained and the attackers eliminated, but it's a near thing. Dawn reveals the slaughter. The sandspit and the riverbank are covered with Japanese bodies. Hundreds of them, lying in windows where they fell, draped over barbed wire, floating in the river. The Americans count 774 confirmed Japanese dead just in their immediate defensive sector. Colonel Ichuki's body is found later, his sword still in his hand. Of his 917 men, fewer than 30 survived to retreat back into the jungle. American casualties are 35 dead and 75 wounded, terrible losses, but nothing compared to the destruction of the Japanese regiment. Colonel Cates, knowing the enemy is broken but not destroyed, orders a counterattack. The 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, crosses the river and pursues the fleeing Japanese. They bring tanks, M3 Stuart light tanks with 37mm guns and machine guns. The tanks pursue the retreating enemy along the beach, catching Japanese soldiers who are too exhausted or wounded to escape. It's not combat, it's execution. The tanks drive over foxholes, crush men hiding in shell craters, machine gun soldiers trying to flee. Some Marines are sickened by it. Others, having seen what the Japanese did to captured soldiers, the torture, the mutilations feel no mercy. By the end of August 21st, Ichuki's regiment has ceased to exist as a fighting force. The Battle of Tenaru, misnamed because the actual river was the Ilu, but the name stuck, was the first major defeat of a Japanese ground force in World War II. The Japanese military had been nearly invincible for a decade. They had crushed Chinese armies, defeated British and Dutch forces, humiliated Americans in the Philippines. The idea that they could be stopped, let alone annihilated, seemed impossible to many Allied observers. Tenaru proved it could be done. It demonstrated that Japanese tactical doctrine, the emphasis on offensive spirit over firepower, the willingness to conduct suicidal charges, was fatally flawed when facing modern defensive firepower. It showed that American Marines, properly positioned and supplied with adequate ammunition, could inflict catastrophic casualties on attacking forces. But Tenaru taught other lessons too, darker lessons that would define the rest of the Pacific War. It showed that the Japanese would literally die to the last man rather than surrender. It demonstrated that wounded Japanese soldiers were still deadly, that approaching a dead enemy could get you killed. It proved that the Japanese concept of honor was completely alien to Western military thinking, not just different but incompatible. There would be no negotiated settlements, no honorable surrenders, no prisoners of war taken except those too badly wounded to kill themselves. Every island, every ridge, every cave would have to be taken by force, and the defenders would fight until killed. This made the Pacific War existential in a way the European War never was. In Europe, German soldiers surrendered by the thousands once their position became untenable. In the Pacific, Japanese soldiers had to be killed or they would keep fighting. Private Harding, who survived Tenaru, would go on to fight at Cape Gloucester and PELELIU. He never forgot that night by the river, the sound of hundreds of men running toward his position screaming in the darkness, the mechanical action of loading and firing his rifle until his arms ached. He never forgot the morning after, walking through the battlefield and seeing the bodies, understanding that each one had been a man with a family, with hopes and fears, now reduced to meat and bone because his commanders had ordered him to attack a prepared position and his code of honor forbade any alternative. War, Harding realized that morning, wasn't glorious. It was industrial-scale killing, and the side with better firepower and smarter tactics would win, no matter how brave the other side was. But Tenaru was only the beginning. 10 days later, the Japanese would try again to retake Henderson Field, and this time they would come with a more sophisticated plan and a much larger force. The resulting battle would become legendary in Marine Corps history as EDSON'S Ridge. 2 nights in September 1942 when a few hundred Marines held a crucial piece of ground against thousands of Japanese attackers, and the outcome hung on the courage of individual men pushed beyond human endurance. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson stands on a ridge south of Henderson Field on the evening of September 12, 1942, and studies the terrain. The ridge isn't much. A low coral spine covered in kanai grass, rising perhaps 100 feet above the surrounding jungle. But it's the key to Henderson Field. Any Japanese force attacking from the south has to cross this ridge to reach the airfield. Edson knows the Japanese are coming. Intelligence indicates a major Japanese force has landed west of the marine perimeter and is moving into position. The question isn't if they'll attack, but when and in what strength. Edson is 45 years old, ancient by World War II standards where many officers are in their 20s. He's a Vermont native who joined the Marine Corps in 1917, fought in France in World War I, served in Nicaragua and China between the wars. His hair is red, hence the nickname, and his personality is legendary. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't give speeches. He leads by example, and that example is absolute fearlessness. His Marines have seen him walk upright through machine gun fire without flinching, seen him personally throw grenades into enemy positions, seen him make tactical decisions with complete calm while shells are landing around him. They call him Red Mike with respect bordering on reverence. If Edson says hold the ridge, they'll hold the ridge or die trying. His force is the 1st Raider Battalion, 840 men organized into companies of about 140 Marines each, plus the 1st Parachute Battalion, another 400 men. The Raiders are a special unit, trained for amphibious operations behind enemy lines, recruited from volunteers who wanted extra training and extra danger. They're lean and hard, Many are veterans of the Tulagi operation weeks earlier. The paratroopers are equally motivated, though their specialized training hasn't proven as useful in the Pacific as hoped. You can't parachute into jungle, it turns out, without hanging helplessly in trees while the enemy shoots you. Together, these roughly 1,200 men are tasked with defending the ridge against whatever comes. The ridge itself, later named EDSON'S Ridge in honor of what happens here, runs roughly north-south, about 1,000 yards long. The southern end is Hill 123, actually only about 120 feet high but the highest point in the area. From Hill 123, the ridge slopes gently down toward Henderson Field to the north. The terrain is covered with kunai grass, 5 to 8 feet tall, which provides concealment but not cover. On either side of the ridge, the ground drops off into thick jungle. A dry ravine runs parallel to the ridge on the west side. The jungle is so thick that visibility is measured in yards. It's perfect terrain for infiltration attacks, for getting close to enemy positions without being seen, for night combat where confusion and fear are weapons as deadly as bullets. Edson positions his forces carefully. Company B, Raiders, holds the southern end around Hill 123. Company C extends the line northward. The paratroopers hold the northern section of the ridge closest to Henderson Field. Machine gun positions are sited to cover the kunai grass approaches. Mortars are registered on likely assembly areas in the jungle. But Edson knows his position has weaknesses. The line is thin, too many yards to cover with too few men. The flanks are in the air, exposed to infiltration. His Marines are exhausted, having fought on Tulagi and then conducted patrols on Guadalcanal for weeks with little rest. Rations are short. Everyone is hungry all the time. Malaria is spreading through the force. Some men have lost 30 pounds since landing on Guadalcanal. They're tough, they're motivated, but they're stretched to the breaking point. Opposing them is General Kyote Kawaguchi with approximately 3,000 men of the 35th Infantry Brigade. Kawaguchi is no fool like Ichuki at Tenaru. He's studied the American positions, he's learned from Ichuki's mistake. He's not going to conduct a frontal assault across open ground. Instead, his plan is sophisticated. He'll infiltrate through the jungle on both sides of the ridge, get his forces as close as possible before dawn, then launch coordinated attacks from multiple directions. He'll use the jungle as concealment, use the darkness to negate American firepower advantages. His men are elite troops, veterans of campaigns in China and the East Indies. They've marched through terrain that would have stopped most armies. 70 miles through jungle without roads, carrying all their supplies and ammunition, eating half rations, moving at night. They're exhausted but determined. They've been told the Americans are weak, that one powerful attack will break them. September 12, 1942, passes with tension but no attack. Marines on the ridge hear movement in the jungle, catch glimpses of Japanese soldiers moving through the undergrowth, take occasional shots at targets that disappear as soon as rifles are raised. Aircraft from Henderson Field drop bombs on suspected Japanese positions in the jungle, but it's hard to target an enemy you can't see. As night falls, Edson moves among his positions, checking fields of fire, making sure ammunition is distributed, speaking quietly to the Marines. "They're coming tonight," he tells them. "Be ready." Around 2,100 hours, Japanese artillery opens fire. Shells begin falling on the ridge. Not American-style preparatory bombardment that lasts for hours, but sharp, concentrated fire designed to suppress the defenders for the crucial minutes when the assault begins. The Marines press themselves into foxholes, curl into the smallest possible targets, pray that a shell doesn't land directly on them. The kunai grass catches fire from shell bursts, adding smoke and flames to the chaos. Then the artillery lifts and the Japanese infantry comes out of the jungle. They come screaming, hundreds of men charging up the slopes of the ridge, firing rifles and machine guns from the hip, officers waving swords, all of them yelling "Banzai" and "Marines, you die." Company B on Hill 123 takes the first impact. The Japanese overrun the southern end of the ridge, simply overwhelm the Marines there by sheer numbers. Hand-to-hand fighting erupts. Marines use bayonets, rifle butts, knives. Some positions are overrun so quickly that Marines don't have time to fire their weapons. It goes straight to bayonets and fists. The company commander is killed. The company is driven from Hill 123, falling back in disorder. But the line doesn't break. Marines fall back to secondary positions and keep fighting. The machine gunners haul their weapons back 50 yards and set up again, start firing. Company C holds its position despite Japanese attacks on both flanks. The paratroopers on the northern end of the ridge are barely engaged yet. The Japanese are concentrating on the southern end, trying to take Hill 123 and roll up the Marine line from south to north. Edson is everywhere. He moves from position to position, completely exposed to enemy fire, directing the defense with calm precision. When a company commander is killed, Edson personally takes command of that unit until a replacement can be found. When a machine gun position is about to be overrun, Edson appears with a rifle and helps beat back the attack. His presence steadies the Marines. If Red Mike isn't worried, then things can't be that bad, right? But things are bad. The Japanese control Hill 123. They're infiltrating through the jungle on both flanks. Marines are running low on ammunition. The line is bent and threatening to break. At one point, Edson climbs onto an empty wooden grenade box, standing upright, completely exposed, and shouts to the Marines around him. His voice carries across the ridge. The only thing the Japs have that you don't is guts. It's not much of a speech, not Henry V before Agincourt, but it's exactly what the men need to hear. They're not being beaten because the enemy is better. They're in a tough fight against a tough opponent, and if they hold their ground, they'll win. Marines who were thinking about falling back decide to stay. Machine gunners who were considering abandoning their positions stay at their guns. The fighting continues through the night. Wave after wave of Japanese attacks comes out of the darkness. The Marines learn to wait until the attackers are within 50 yards before opening fire, conserving ammunition, maximizing the effectiveness of each shot. When they run out of rifle ammunition, they use hand grenades. When they run out of grenades, they throw rocks. At one position, Marines actually throw rocks at attacking Japanese because they've literally exhausted every other option. It works. The Japanese, surprised by this desperate tactic, fall back and the Marines have time to redistribute ammunition from casualties. Major Kenneth Bailey, commanding the raider companies, is killed leading a counterattack to retake Hill 123. He's hit by machine gun fire while personally leading Marines forward, keeps advancing until he collapses, dies before he can be evacuated. His Marines continue the attack and actually retake the hill briefly before being driven off by another Japanese counterattack. The hill changes hands 3 times during the night, each time at tremendous cost to both sides. Dawn on September 13th brings temporary relief. The Japanese pull back into the jungle as American artillery begins plastering the southern approaches with high explosive shells. Fighter aircraft from Henderson Field, the reason this whole battle matters, take off and strafe Japanese positions in the jungle. The Marines count their losses. Casualties are heavy. Dozens dead. Over 100 wounded. Ammunition is dangerously low. The ridge is littered with bodies, both American and Japanese. The stench of death in the tropical heat is overwhelming. Edson knows the Japanese will attack again. They've committed too many forces to abandon the offensive after one night. During the day, Marines redistribute ammunition, evacuate wounded, improve their positions. They move casualties back to aid stations where Navy corpsmen work frantically to save lives. The corpsmen, young men with minimal medical training thrust into battlefield surgery, are heroes nobody talks about enough. They crawl through machine gun fire to reach wounded Marines. They work on sucking chest wounds and compound fractures with their bare hands. They stay with the wounded even when the position is being overrun. Doc, the Marines call them, and every single one is beloved by his unit. Reinforcements arrive during the day. The 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, about 500 men, reaches the ridge and extends the defensive line. Ammunition is brought forward, cases of rifle cartridges, belts for the machine guns, crates of hand grenades. Artillery crews bring more shells forward. Food arrives, sea rations, not hot meals but food nonetheless. The Marines eat mechanically, too exhausted to taste anything, knowing they need calories for the night ahead. Night falls on September 13th, and the Japanese come again. This time the attack is even more intense. Kawaguchi has committed his reserves, throwing everything he has at the Marine positions. The artillery barrage is heavier, the infantry assaults more determined. The Japanese have learned from the previous night. They come in smaller groups, infiltrating between Marine positions, getting close before revealing themselves. Fighting erupts all along the ridge. There's no front line anymore, just swirling chaos where Japanese and American soldiers are mixed together in the darkness. A Japanese soldier jumps into Edson's command post foxhole, bayonet fixed, lunging at the colonel. Edson shoots him with his pistol at point-blank range. Another Japanese soldier appears and is shot by Edson's radioman. The command post is nearly overrun but holds. Nearby, a machine gun crew fights off 3 separate charges, fires their weapon until the barrel glows red, keeps firing until Japanese bodies are piled 10 feet in front of their position. When the gun finally jams from overheating, the crew abandons it and falls back, but they've bought crucial minutes for other positions to adjust. The fighting is so confused that Marines are shooting at sounds, throwing grenades at movement, stabbing at shadows. Friendly fire incidents are inevitable in this chaos, but there's no alternative. The Japanese are everywhere, and if you don't shoot first, you die. A Marine private finds himself fighting hand-to-hand with a Japanese officer, the officer swinging a sword, the Marine blocking with his rifle. The rifle stock splinters under a sword blow, but the Marine manages to shoot the officer with his sidearm. He'll remember the officer's face for the rest of his life. A man about 30, well-fed, probably from a good family, dying in the mud on a jungle ridge thousands of miles from home because his emperor and his code of honor demanded it. The crisis comes around midnight. The Japanese breakthrough on the southern end of the ridge threatens to split the Marine position. If they succeed, they can roll up both flanks and the entire defense will collapse. Edson commits his last reserves, personally leading them forward. The Marines counterattack, not in neat lines but in small groups of men following their officers, moving from shell crater to shell crater, firing and advancing. This desperate, brutal work. Men die within feet of each other. The fighting is at such close range that grenades are too dangerous to use. They kill friend and foe alike. The Marines retake Hill 123 for the final time. The cost is terrible. The company that makes the assault loses half its strength. But the hill is back in American hands. The Japanese, sensing their moment has passed, begin to fall back. Small groups continue to fight, conducting local counterattacks, but the coordinated offensive is over. By 0200 hours on September 14th, the battle is effectively won. The Japanese pull back into the jungle, leaving hundreds of bodies on the ridge. Dawn reveals the price of victory. Marine casualties are 104 killed and over 200 wounded, roughly 25% of the force that held the ridge. Japanese casualties are estimated at 600 killed, with unknown numbers wounded. The entire southern end of the ridge is carpeted with bodies. The kunai grass is burned away in places, trampled flat in others. The smell is indescribable, cordite and blood and shit and rot. The Marine positions look like slaughterhouses. Weapons are broken, ammunition is exhausted. Every man still standing is wounded or concussed or both. But Henderson Field is secure. The Japanese never came close to the airfield itself. The ridge that Edson chose to defend proved to be the linchpin of the entire defense. By holding that ground, by refusing to break no matter the cost, the Marines ensured that American aircraft could continue flying from Henderson Field, which meant the Japanese could never successfully reinforce Guadalcanal, which meant the entire Japanese position in the Solomons would eventually collapse. Strategic implications aside, what happened on Edson's Ridge was simply this. A few hundred exhausted, outnumbered Marines fought through 2 nights of hell and refused to give up even when giving up would have been completely understandable. They held because holding was what Marines did. The Battle of Edson's Ridge became a defining moment in Marine Corps history. It demonstrated that Marines could hold defensive positions against numerically superior forces conducting night attacks, something that was by no means certain in September 1942. It proved that American firepower, properly employed, could defeat Japanese tactics even when those tactics were executed with skill and determination. It showed that leadership mattered, that Edson's calm presence during the crisis had been as important as any tactical decision. And it reinforced the lesson from Tenaru that the Japanese would not stop attacking until they were physically incapable of continuing. There would be no rational calculation that the position was untenable, no recognition that further attacks were pointless. They would fight until killed. Edson would survive the war, retire as a major general, and live until 1955. The ridge would forever bear his name. The Marines who fought there spoke of those 2 nights for the rest of their lives, not with pride exactly, but with a kind of haunted recognition that they had endured something beyond normal human experience and come through it. They had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back, and they had not flinched. Fast forward 2 years to September 15, 1944, and the nature of Pacific warfare has changed. The Marines landing on PELELIU are veterans of multiple campaigns. They fought on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, SAIPAN. They know what to expect: murderous fire on the beaches, suicidal Banzai charges, fanatical defense. What they don't know is that the Japanese have been learning too, and Colonel Kunio Nakagawa has spent months turning PELELIU into a nightmare that will make previous battles look simple. PELELIU is a small island in the Palau Group, 6 miles long and 2 miles wide. On a map, it looks insignificant. In reality, it's a fortress. The island is coral limestone, honeycombed with natural caves that the Japanese have improved and connected. Nakagawa has 10,900 men under his command, and he's abandoned traditional Japanese tactics. There will be no Banzai charges. There will be no contesting the beaches with everything available. Instead, Nakagawa has moved his forces inland to the Umerbrogal ridges. The Marines will call them Bloody Nose Ridge, where he's created a defensive system so sophisticated that every cave is a fortress, every position has multiple firing ports, and everything is connected by tunnels so defenders can retreat from one position and appear in another hundreds of yards away. The temperature on PELELIU is 115 degrees Fahrenheit. The humidity is crushing. Water is scarce. The available water is contaminated with coral dust, tastes like sulfur, causes diarrhea and vomiting. The coral itself is razor-sharp, shreds clothing and skin. Men cut their hands to ribbons trying to dig foxholes. The heat is so intense that metal becomes too hot to touch, that weapons malfunction, that men collapse from heatstroke while standing still. This is the environment where the Marines will fight for 73 days of continuous combat. The invasion begins with the usual massive bombardment. Navy ships blast the island for 3 days. Aircraft drop bombs. PELELIU disappears under smoke and dust. Naval officers report the island has been neutralized. Then the Marines land and discover that neutralized means nothing when the enemy is deep underground. The 1st Marine Division, veterans of Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester, hits the beaches in waves. The landing is eerily quiet at first. Then the Japanese artillery opens fire, and hell begins. The shells fall among the landing craft in the water on the beach. Marines take casualties before they even reach shore. Those who make it to the beach find themselves pinned down by machine gun fire from positions they can't see. The Japanese have created firing ports in the coral cliffs, positions with interlocking fields of fire, everything pre-sighted for maximum effect. Marines advance by inches, using flamethrowers and explosives to reduce one position at a time, only to discover another position covering it. The temperature and the stress and the combat load combine to create casualties from heatstroke that rival casualties from enemy fire. Men collapse, vomit, can't continue. Corpsmen work frantically, but they're overwhelmed. The fight moves inland. The Marines take the airfield, the supposed objective of the whole operation, in 2 days. But taking the airfield doesn't end the battle. Nakagawa's forces are in the ridges, and those ridges have to be taken. The Umerbrogal is a nightmare of coral pinnacles, some 50 feet high, all of them hiding cave entrances. Approach one cave and fire comes from 3 others. Use explosives to seal a cave and the defenders retreat through tunnels and emerge somewhere else. The Marines develop tactics: flamethrowers to burn out the oxygen, explosives to seal entrances, tanks with 75mm guns firing point-blank into cave mouths. But every position costs casualties. Captain Everett Pope and his company from the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, are ordered to take Hill 100, a coral pinnacle on the edge of the Umerbrogal. Pope is 25 years old, from Massachusetts, a pre-war Marine who's already won the Bronze Star on Guadalcanal. His company numbers 90 men when they begin the assault on September 19th. Hill 100 doesn't look that bad from a distance. A steep coral ridge, maybe 100 feet high, covered in scrub vegetation. But getting there requires crossing 500 yards of open ground under fire from positions on the surrounding ridges. Pope's company advances in short rushes, using every bit of cover. They take casualties crossing the open ground, men hit by machine gun fire, others wounded by mortar shells. They reach the base of Hill 100 and begin climbing. The coral is loose and crumbles under their hands. It's like climbing a pile of broken glass. Men slip and fall, cutting themselves on the sharp edges. They're carrying rifles, ammunition, water, grenades, climbing one-handed, completely exposed to fire from above. Some don't make it, hit by grenades rolled down from above, or shot by Japanese soldiers firing from caves in the hillside. They reach the top. There's no level ground, just a series of coral pinnacles separated by crevasses. Pope establishes a perimeter of sorts, putting his Marines in whatever cover they can find. They're cut off, no way to evacuate wounded, no way to bring up supplies. The water they carried is already gone in the brutal heat. Ammunition is limited. Night falls and the Japanese counterattack. The attacks come from all sides. Japanese soldiers emerge from caves the Marines didn't know existed, from tunnels that connect to positions on adjacent ridges, from crevasses in the coral itself. The fighting is at arm's length. Grenades thrown, bayonets used, men grappling hand-to-hand on the coral ridges. Pope's Marines run out of ammunition and use their rifles as clubs. They run out of grenades and throw coral rocks. When the rocks run out, they fight with their hands. This continues through the night, attack after attack after attack. By dawn, Pope's company has shrunk from 90 men to 9. The rest are dead or wounded so badly they can't fight. The 9 survivors are out of ammunition, out of water, out of everything. They're ordered to withdraw, and they make it down the hill, carrying their wounded, Japanese fire following them every step. Pope will receive the Medal of Honor for what he did on Hill 100. But the medal doesn't change the fact that 81 of his Marines were casualties in one night of fighting for one small hill that the Americans couldn't even hold. This is PELELIU. Every ridge, every cave, every coral pinnacle costs casualties. Companies go into battle with 250 men and come out with 50. The replacements arrive and become casualties within days. The heat and the terrain and the constant combat break men who survived previous battles without psychological problems. Combat fatigue, what later wars will call PTSD, becomes epidemic. Men develop the 1,000-yard stare, stop reacting to incoming fire, sit in their foxholes staring at nothing. Corpsmen work on physical wounds but can't help the psychological ones. Navy corpsman John Bradley, later famous as one of the men in the Iwo Jima flag-raising photograph, though that's a different battle, works on PELELIU with the Graves Registration Unit. He helps identify bodies, write death certificates, prepare remains for burial. The work destroys him psychologically. He sees friends torn apart by explosions, sees men die from wounds that should have been treatable but weren't because the combat was too intense to evacuate them in time. He sees what modern weapons do to human bodies. After the war, he never speaks about PELELIU. His family asks and he changes the subject. Some experiences can't be shared with people who weren't there. The battle continues through September and into October. The Army's 81st Infantry Division relieves the 1st Marine Division, which has taken 71% casualties, 6,526 men killed or wounded out of approximately 9,000 who landed. This is the highest casualty rate of any Marine division in any battle in World War II. The Army continues the fight, cave by cave, using flamethrowers and explosives and tank fire to reduce each position. Nakagawa fights until only a handful of his men remain, then commits ritual suicide on November 24, 1944. The island is finally declared secure on November 27, 73 days after the landing. The strategic value of PELELIU remains controversial. The airfield was supposed to support MacArthur's invasion of the Philippines, but the Philippines operation succeeded without it. Some historians argue PELELIU was unnecessary, that the island could have been bypassed and left to wither without supplies. Others argue it prevented Japanese aircraft from interfering with the Philippines operation. What's not controversial is the human cost: 11,000 American casualties, 1,800 killed, 8,000 wounded, for an island 6 miles long. Marines who fought on PELELIU considered it the toughest battle of the Pacific War, worse than Iwo Jima, worse than Okinawa. The combination of heat, terrain, and sophisticated Japanese defense made every day a nightmare. Captain Pope, who survived PELELIU, would also survive the war. He spoke of Hill 100 occasionally, always with a sense of loss for the men who died there. He said the worst part wasn't the fighting itself but the morning after, realizing how many hadn't made it, knowing their families would receive telegrams telling them their sons or brothers had been killed in action, and those families would never really understand what had happened on that coral ridge in the darkness. How could they? How could anyone who wasn't there understand what it was like to fight all night with your bare hands because you'd run out of everything else? Before PELELIU, in June 1944, the Marines fought another battle that demonstrated both their tactical skill and the horrifying reality of Japanese fanaticism. SAIPAN in the Mariana Islands was not just another island. It was Japanese territory, administered by Japanese civilians, considered part of the homeland. Its loss would bring American B-29 bombers within range of Japan itself. The Japanese garrison of 30,000 soldiers and sailors knew they couldn't win, but under Bushido, surrender was not an option. They would fight to the death, and they would take thousands of American lives with them. The invasion begins on June 15, 1944, with 20,000 Marines hitting the beaches at 0830 hours. The landing is chaos. Japanese artillery has the beaches pre-sighted. Shells fall among the landing craft. Amtraks burn as they reach the shore. Marines wade ashore through debris and bodies, take cover behind disabled vehicles, push inland against fierce resistance. Unlike PELELIU, where the Japanese allow the landing and fight from inland positions, on SAIPAN they contest every yard. The first day alone costs 2,000 American casualties. Among those landing is Sergeant Thomas Baker, a 22-year-old from New York, serving with Company A, 1st Battalion, 105th Infantry Regiment. Baker is not a Marine, he's Army, part of the 27th Infantry Division that lands on SAIPAN after the initial Marine assault. But his actions on SAIPAN will earn him the Medal of Honor and demonstrate that courage is not the exclusive property of any particular service. The battle for SAIPAN develops into a grinding advance up the island. The Japanese fight from caves and concrete bunkers, from sugar cane fields where visibility is measured in feet, from villages that have to be cleared house by house. The civilian population, thousands of Japanese citizens, becomes part of the nightmare. Japanese propaganda has told them the Americans will rape and torture them. As the Marines advance, civilians retreat ahead of them, some forced by Japanese soldiers, others moving of their own accord. The final horror awaits at the island's northern cliffs. Sergeant Baker's actions begin on July 19, 1944, at Nafutan Point. Japanese forces are holding a position that's blocking the American advance. The position consists of several concrete pillboxes with machine guns and anti-tank weapons, mutually supporting, all of them well-sighted to cover the approaches. The attack bogs down. Men are pinned by fire from positions they can't reach. Baker, seeing the situation, grabs a bazooka and ammunition and moves forward alone. A bazooka is not a precision weapon. It's a tube that fires a rocket-propelled grenade, effective against fortifications but with minimal range and accuracy. Using one effectively requires getting close to the target, and getting close means exposing yourself to enemy fire. Baker doesn't hesitate. He moves from cover to cover, gets within 50 yards of the first pillbox, and fires. The rocket hits the firing port. The explosion kills the crew inside. He reloads, a clumsy process that requires inserting a new rocket into the rear of the tube while staying under cover, and advances to the next pillbox. Another shot, another hit. The pillbox falls silent. He continues, systematically destroying 4 pillboxes in this manner, each time exposing himself to fire from the other positions, each time somehow surviving the machine gun bullets and rifle fire that kick up dirt around him. His actions break the Japanese defense at Nafutan Point. The American advance continues. Baker has saved dozens of lives by eliminating positions that could have pinned down his unit for hours or days. But the battle for SAIPAN continues, and Baker's war is not finished. On July 6th, the Japanese launch their final desperate gamble, a Banzai charge with 5,000 men, the largest of the Pacific War. They attack at 0400 hours, emerging from the darkness in waves, some armed only with bamboo spears or bayonets lashed to poles. They overrun American positions, break through the defensive lines, create chaos. The fighting is desperate and confused. Artillery fires at point-blank range. Marines use weapons taken from dead Japanese because their own weapons are empty or broken. The Japanese advance nearly a mile before being stopped by a combination of firepower and sheer desperation on the American side. Sergeant Baker is wounded in this attack. A grenade explodes near him, sending shrapnel into his abdomen and thigh. He refuses evacuation and continues fighting. Later that day, he's wounded again, machine gun fire catching him in the back. The wounds are serious but not immediately fatal. His unit is falling back, conducting a fighting withdrawal to more defensible positions. Baker can't walk. His squad leader wants to carry him out, but Baker knows that will slow them down, that the Japanese are close behind, that carrying him might get them all killed. "Just prop me up against that tree," Baker says. The words will be remembered and repeated for decades. "Give me my pistol and 8 rounds of ammunition." His squad leader refuses. Baker insists. Finally, understanding that they have no choice, his brothers prop him in a sitting position against a tree, give him his .45 caliber pistol and 8 rounds, and withdraw. Baker sits against the tree, alone, waiting for the Japanese he knows are coming. They find his body the next morning. 13 dead Japanese soldiers lie in a semicircle around the tree. His pistol is empty. The 8 rounds have become 8 dead enemies. Baker's body shows he was bayoneted multiple times after running out of ammunition, but he fought until the end. The Japanese who killed him probably respected his warrior spirit. Bushido recognized courage regardless of nationality. His sacrifice bought time for his unit to withdraw and reorganize, potentially saving dozens of lives. SAIPAN falls on July 9, 1944, though isolated Japanese resistance continues for months. Captain Sakai Oba conducts a guerrilla campaign with 46 survivors, hiding in caves, raiding American positions for supplies, refusing to believe the war is over. He doesn't surrender until December 1945, 16 months after SAIPAN was declared secure, and only then because his conscience won't allow him to continue leading his men to pointless deaths. But the most horrifying aspect of SAIPAN isn't the military battle. It's what happens at Marpi Point, the northern cliffs where Japanese civilians have been driven by the advancing Americans. Japanese soldiers tell the civilians that surrender means torture and death. The propaganda has been so effective that they believe it absolutely. As Marines reach the cliffs, they witness civilian families jumping to their deaths. Parents throw children over the cliffs first, then jump themselves. Entire families hold hands and leap together. Grandparents, pregnant women, infants, all choosing death over capture. Marines shout at them to stop, wave white flags, try to communicate that they won't be harmed. Some civilians are saved, but hundreds, perhaps thousands, choose death. Marines who witness this are traumatized in ways combat itself couldn't accomplish. To watch children die, to see families destroyed by propaganda and fear, to be unable to prevent it, this haunts men for the rest of their lives. The cost of SAIPAN is 16,525 American casualties, 3,426 killed, approximately 24,000 Japanese soldiers killed, and an unknown number of civilian deaths. The victory allows B-29 bombers to begin raiding Japan, starting the strategic bombing campaign that will culminate in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The path to Japanese defeat is clear now, but the price keeps rising. 1 year earlier, in November 1943, the Marine Corps demonstrated once again that individual heroism could change the course of battle. The invasion of Bougainville in the Solomon Islands was a crucial step in isolating the major Japanese base at Rebelle. The plan, Operation Cherry Blossom, called for landing at Cape Torquena on Bougainville's west coast, an unexpected location that would hopefully achieve tactical surprise. The Marines would establish a beachhead, allow Army units to pass through, and those army units would build airfields that would bring Rebel within range of American fighters. The Allied deception plan is elaborate. False radio traffic suggests attacks elsewhere. Reconnaissance aircraft photograph beaches far from the actual landing site. Japanese intelligence concludes the attack will come at the more obvious locations. When the invasion force appears off Cape Torquina on November 1, 1943, the Japanese are caught off guard. The defending force at Cape Torquina is small, maybe 300 soldiers, but they're well-positioned and determined to resist. The 3rd Marine Division begins landing at 0726 hours. Initial resistance is light. Small arms fire from the beach, some mortar shells. Then the Marines discover the problem. A single Japanese 75mm gun is positioned on a ridge overlooking the beaches. The position is perfect. It has clear fields of fire over the entire landing area. It's protected by jungle that makes air strikes ineffective, and it's manned by a crew that knows exactly what they're doing. The gun opens fire on the landing craft, on the Amtraks bringing men and supplies ashore, on the beaches themselves. Shells explode among the Marines, throwing bodies into the air, destroying vehicles, creating carnage. The landing force commander, General Alan Turnage, watches from offshore as his carefully planned operation threatens to come apart. The gun has to be silenced or the landing will fail. Infantry tries to advance on the position but is driven back by Japanese machine guns covering the gun. Artillery can't get a clear shot because the gun is dug in and protected. Aircraft drop bombs but miss. The jungle canopy makes targeting nearly impossible. Hours pass and the gun continues firing. Casualties mount. Landing craft are burning on the beach. The schedule is falling apart. Turnage considers calling off the landing, withdrawing the forces already ashore, trying again somewhere else. Then Sergeant Robert Allen Owens decides he's had enough. Owens is 26 years old, from South Carolina, big for his era at 6'3" and 232 pounds. He's a squad leader in Company A, 3rd Marine Division, a quiet professional who enlisted in 1937 and has spent 6 years in the peacetime Marine Corps learning his trade. His squad is pinned down with the rest of his company, unable to advance because of fire from the gun position and the supporting machine guns. Owens watches the gun fire again, sees the shell explode among Marines on the beach, watches men die. He makes a decision. Someone has to do something, and if not him, then who? He tells his squad where he's going. They try to stop him. It's suicide. The gun position is protected by machine guns. There's no cover for the approach. He'll be killed before he gets close. Owens nods, acknowledges their concerns, goes anyway. He moves forward alone, rifle in hand, using every bit of cover the jungle provides. Japanese machine gunners see him and open fire. Bullets clip branches around him, kick up dirt, but he keeps moving. He's fast for a big man, using his size and strength to crash through vegetation that would stop smaller men. He reaches the base of the ridge where the gun is positioned. The approach is steep coral rock, nearly vertical in places, completely exposed to fire from above. Owens begins climbing. Bullets hit the coral near his hands. Shrapnel from ricochets cuts his face and arms. He climbs anyway, hand over hand, finding holds in the coral, pulling himself upward. How he isn't killed during this climb defies explanation. Luck, Japanese surprise at his audacity, divine intervention, choose your explanation. He reaches the top of the ridge. The gun position is a concrete emplacement with a firing port facing the beaches. The gun crew, 5 Japanese soldiers, is so focused on targeting the landing beaches that they don't realize Owens is behind them until he fires his rifle through a gap in the fortification. The first shot kills the gun commander. The rest of the crew panics. The position, designed to repel attacks from the front, is vulnerable from the rear. Owens fires repeatedly, working the bolt of his rifle, shooting into the confined space of the gun emplacement. The Japanese crew attempts to defend themselves, but they're trapped in their own fortification. 3 more die in the emplacement. The last one flees through the front firing port and is shot by Marines below who now have a clear shot at the position. Owens stands at the gun position, having accomplished the impossible. Then Japanese soldiers in the surrounding jungle, realizing what's happened, turn their weapons on him. Machine gun fire rakes the position. Owens is hit multiple times, chest, abdomen, legs. He falls, mortally wounded. Marines reach him within minutes, but there's nothing they can do. He dies from his wounds shortly after. But the gun is silent. The landing continues. The Marines establish their beachhead. Operation Cherry Blossom succeeds because one sergeant decided that his life was a worthwhile price to pay for the lives of his brothers and the success of the mission. Admiral Chester Nimitz will later say of actions like Owens, "Uncommon valor was a common virtue." The phrase captures something essential about the Pacific War. Time and again, individual Marines performed acts of heroism that defied rational explanation. They charged machine gun positions they couldn't possibly take. They held defensive lines that couldn't possibly be held. They advanced when advancing was insane and held when holding was impossible. They did this not because they were superhuman but because they were Marines, and their brothers needed them, and the mission demanded it. Owens receives the Medal of Honor posthumously. His family receives it at a ceremony, and his mother accepts the medal and the folded flag and tries to understand why her son had to die on a jungle ridge in a place she'd never heard of before the war. There's no good answer. The only answer is that the Japanese had to be stopped, that stopping them required taking islands, that taking islands required someone to silence that gun, and Robert Owens was the one who did it. His death saved hundreds, perhaps thousands, of American lives. His sacrifice allowed the operation to continue, which allowed airfields to be built, which allowed Rabaul to be neutralized, which shortened the war and saved more lives. Butterfly effects in blood. 5 battles. 5 different tactical situations. 5 examples of Marines pushed beyond the limits of human endurance and refusing to break. What connects them? What makes these the most insane Marine moves of World War II? First, the absolute refusal to surrender or retreat. At Tenaru, the defensive line could have broken when the Japanese attacks came screaming out of the darkness. The Marines held. At EDSON'S Ridge, when Company B was driven from Hill 123, the entire position could have collapsed. The Marines rallied and held. At Bougainville, the landing could have been called off when the Japanese gun dominated the beaches. Instead, Owens charged the position alone. At SAIPAN, Baker could have accepted evacuation when wounded. He refused and fought until he died. At PELELIU, Pope's company could have withdrawn from Hill 100 during the night when they ran out of ammunition. They fought with rocks in their hands until dawn. This wasn't stubbornness. It was a deep-rooted conviction that Marines don't quit. Second, the willingness to sacrifice for brothers. Baker's final stand saved his unit. Owens' charge saved the landing force. Pope's company held Hill 100 so other units could advance. Individual Marines throughout these battles threw themselves on grenades, charged into fire to save wounded comrades, stayed at their posts when they could have fled. This wasn't abstract patriotism. It was concrete love for the men fighting beside them. When Marines say they fought for each other rather than for flag or country, they're telling the literal truth. Third, adaptation under pressure. The Marines learned quickly. After Tenaru, they understood that Japanese night attacks would be a constant threat. At EDSON'S Ridge, they developed tactics for holding defensive positions in darkness. By PELELIU, they had learned cave-clearing techniques using flamethrowers and explosives in combination. At SAIPAN, they conducted the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific to that date, coordinating naval gunfire, air support, and ground advance with increasing sophistication. The learning curve was steep and paid for in blood, but the Marines learned. Fourth, leadership that inspired rather than commanded. Edson standing on a grenade box during the crisis at his ridge. Pope leading his company onto Hill 100 knowing it was likely a death sentence. Baker refusing evacuation and insisting on being left behind. These men led by example, never asking their Marines to do something they wouldn't do themselves. The result was a force where rank mattered less than competence and courage, where privates followed lieutenants into hell because those lieutenants had proven they would share every risk. Fifth, the human cost that's impossible to quantify. The 2,600 Marines still listed as missing on PELELIU alone. The thousands more buried in military cemeteries across the Pacific. The tens of thousands wounded physically, the hundreds of thousands scarred psychologically. Every statistic represents a man who left home believing in something larger than himself, who trained and sailed and fought and died or was broken on volcanic rock and coral islands whose names most Americans couldn't locate on a map. They paid a price we cannot adequately honor with words or memorials. The strategic impact of these battles is clear. Guadalcanal, where both Tenaru and EDSON'S Ridge were fought, was the first step in the Allied offensive that would end in Tokyo Bay. Bougainville neutralized Rabaul, removing a major Japanese base from the war. SAIPAN brought B-29s within range of Japan, beginning the strategic bombing that would devastate Japanese cities and industry. PELELIU remains controversial, but even if unnecessary, it demonstrated that the Japanese were adapting their tactics, that the closer the Allies got to Japan, the more fanatical the resistance would become. These lessons influenced planning for the invasion of the Japanese home islands, an invasion that never happened because atomic weapons ended the war, but an invasion that would have cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties if it had been necessary. The human stories matter more than the strategy. Private Harding at Tenaru, firing his rifle until his arms ached, walking through the battlefield afterward and seeing the cost. The Marines on EDSON'S Ridge fighting through 2 nights of hell, throwing rocks when they ran out of ammunition, refusing to break. Captain Pope watching his company shrink from 90 men to 9 on Hill 100. Knowing he was ordering men to their deaths but having no alternative. Sergeant Baker sitting against a tree with 8 bullets, waiting for the Japanese he knew were coming. Sergeant Owens climbing a coral ridge under fire because someone had to silence that gun. These weren't superheroes from comic books. They were farmers' sons and factory workers, high school graduates and college dropouts, men who joined the Marines for a paycheck or adventure, or because their friends were joining. The war took these ordinary men and demanded extraordinary things from them, and somehow, impossibly, they delivered. The Japanese soldiers they fought deserve recognition too. History is written by victors, but the vanquished also have stories. Colonel Ichuki leading his men across the Tenaru sandspit knowing he was leading them to death but unable to conceive of any alternative given his code of honor. General Kawaguchi committing his forces to night attacks on EDSON'S Ridge, watching his men die in waves, continuing the attacks because retreat was unthinkable. Colonel Nakagawa on PELELIU, creating a defensive system so sophisticated it would influence Japanese tactics for the rest of the war, fighting for months in hopeless conditions before taking his own life when no other options remained. The Japanese soldiers on SAIPAN charging into American machine guns armed with bamboo spears because surrender violated everything they had been taught about honor and duty. These men were not monsters. They were products of a militaristic culture that had taught them that death was preferable to dishonor, that the emperor was divine, that Japan's destiny was to dominate Asia. They fought with incredible courage for a cause that history has judged harshly, but their courage itself was real. The legacy of these battles lives on in Marine Corps culture. Every Marine recruit learns about EDSON'S Ridge during basic training. The defense of that position has become mythical, the moment when a few hundred exhausted Marines held against overwhelming odds because holding was what Marines did. Officers study the tactical decisions made during these battles, analyzing what worked and what failed. The lessons learned at Tenaru about the necessity of overwhelming firepower in defensive positions. The lessons from PELELIU about the difficulties of cave warfare and the need for specialized equipment and tactics. The lessons from SAIPAN about the fanaticism that cultural conditioning could produce in an enemy. These aren't abstract historical lessons. They're practical knowledge that has influenced Marine Corps doctrine for 8 decades. The cost haunts anyone who studies these battles seriously. The numbers are staggering. On PELELIU alone, the 1st Marine Division took 71% casualties, 6,526 men killed or wounded. Companies that landed with 250 men came off the island with 50. And of those 50, how many were truly whole? How many had seen things that would give them nightmares for decades? How many would drink too much, struggle with relationships, find civilian life hollow after the intensity of combat? The visible wounded, the men missing limbs, the burn victims, the blinded and the crippled, represented only a fraction of the casualties. The invisible wounds, the psychological trauma that 1940s medicine didn't recognize or know how to treat, affected nearly everyone who survived these battles. Jacob Vouza, the native scout who was tortured and left for dead but crawled back to Marine lines to deliver his warning before Tenaru, survived the war. He lived until 1984, honored by the United States and Britain for his service. But he carried the scars of those bayonet wounds for the rest of his life, and the memories of that night when Japanese soldiers stabbed him repeatedly and left him tied to a tree to die. He never spoke much about it, just said he did what needed to be done. That stoicism characterized so many who fought in the Pacific. They did impossible things, survived impossible situations, and afterward they just got on with life because what else could they do? The men who came home from these battles returned to an America that couldn't possibly understand what they had experienced. How do you explain to your family what it was like to fight on EDSON'S Ridge for 2 nights, running out of ammunition and throwing rocks at Japanese soldiers? How do you make your wife understand why you wake up screaming, why you can't stand crowds, why you drink until you pass out because that's the only way to stop the memories? Most didn't try to explain. They buried it, dealt with it as best they could, got jobs and raised families and pretended to be normal. But they weren't normal. They were men who had seen the worst that humanity could do to itself, who had participated in industrial-scale killing, who had watched friends die in ways no human should die. The war ended in 1945, but for them it never really ended. The Marine Corps itself was transformed by these battles. The pre-war corps of 20,000 men had expanded to nearly 500,000 by war's end. The small peacetime force of professionals became a massive wartime organization that had to integrate hundreds of thousands of volunteers and draftees, train them, equip them, and send them into combat. The lessons learned in these early battles, Tenaru in August 1942, EDSON'S Ridge in September 1942, shaped how the Corps would fight for the rest of the war. The tactics developed at terrible cost on Guadalcanal would be refined and improved throughout the island-hopping campaign. By Iwo Jima and Okinawa in 1945, the Marines had become devastatingly efficient at amphibious assault and the reduction of fortified positions. But that efficiency was purchased with the blood of men like those who fought at Tenaru and EDSON'S Ridge, men who learned through brutal trial and error because nobody had fought this kind of war before. Consider the technology changes that these battles drove. After Tenaru and EDSON'S Ridge demonstrated the difficulties of night combat in the jungle, the Marines demanded better night vision equipment, better communication systems for coordinating defensive fire, better illumination systems. After PELELIU showed the difficulties of cave warfare, they developed specialized weapons, flamethrowers with longer range, explosives designed specifically for sealing cave entrances, tanks with heavier guns for point-blank fire into fortifications. The amphibious assault techniques used at SAIPAN were far more sophisticated than those used at Guadalcanal 2 years earlier, with better coordination of naval gunfire, air support, and ground assault. Each battle generated lessons that influenced the next, a learning process written in blood. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan that began from SAIPAN in late 1944 would eventually lead to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The moral arguments about those bombings continue to this day. But one undeniable fact is that every island taken, every battle fought, made it clearer that invading the Japanese home islands would cost catastrophic casualties on both sides. The fanaticism displayed at SAIPAN, where civilians threw themselves from cliffs rather than surrender, suggested what an invasion of Japan itself would entail. The defense of PELELIU, where the Japanese fought for 73 days from fortified positions despite having no hope of victory or relief, demonstrated that the Japanese military would fight literally to the last man. Projections for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, estimated American casualties could reach 500,000, with Japanese military and civilian casualties numbering in the millions. When Truman made the decision to use atomic weapons, he did so with the knowledge of what conventional conquest of Japan would cost. That knowledge came from battles like the 5 discussed here. The 2,600 Marines still unaccounted for from PELELIU alone represent a debt that can never be repaid. They went into combat on that coral island in September 1944, and they never came home. Their remains lie somewhere in the caves and ridges of PELELIU, never recovered, never identified, never returned to their families for burial. The same is true for thousands more across the Pacific. Men whose bodies were lost at sea during amphibious assaults, men buried in hasty graves that were never found, men whose remains were so badly destroyed by explosives or fire that identification was impossible. Every Memorial Day, every Veterans Day, we honor their sacrifice with ceremonies and speeches. But words are inadequate. What honor can speeches provide to a man who died at age 19 in a cave on PELELIU, whose family spent decades not knowing exactly what happened to him, who has no grave his descendants can visit? The answer is that we cannot adequately honor them. We can only remember them, tell their stories, and ensure that their sacrifice is never forgotten. That's why these 5 battles matter. Not because they were the largest or the most strategically important, though several were both, but because they exemplify the human cost of war and the courage that ordinary men displayed when faced with extraordinary demands. Private Harding at Tenaru, firing his rifle through the night at enemies he couldn't see clearly, walking through the aftermath and realizing he had participated in industrial-scale killing. The Marines on EDSON'S ridge throwing rocks when they ran out of ammunition because retreat was not an option. Sergeant Owens climbing a coral ridge under fire because a gun had to be silenced and he was the one who decided to do it. Sergeant Baker sitting against a tree with 8 bullets, insisting his brothers leave him behind so they could survive. Captain Pope watching his company shrink to 9 men while fighting for a hill that couldn't even be held. These moments of individual courage in desperate circumstances represent something fundamental about the human spirit, the capacity to transcend self-interest and fear when something larger is at stake. The Japanese perspective matters too, and it's worth considering as we reflect on these battles. From their viewpoint, they were defending their empire, their emperor, their way of life. The men who charged across the Tenaru sandspit weren't mindless fanatics. They were soldiers following orders and adhering to a code of honor that made surrender unthinkable. The soldiers who attacked EDSON'S ridge night after night, taking catastrophic casualties, believed they were serving a divine emperor and that death in battle was the highest honor. The garrison on PELELIU that fought for 73 days in hopeless conditions wasn't being irrational. They were following a military code that defined their identity and gave their lives meaning. We can recognize their courage while still acknowledging that the cause they served was ultimately wrong, that Japanese militarism had to be defeated, that the suffering inflicted by Japanese forces on conquered populations was monstrous. War creates these moral complexities, brave men serving evil causes, atrocities committed by soldiers who are also capable of nobility and self-sacrifice. The Pacific War was not a good war, in the sense that World War II is sometimes portrayed in American culture. There was nothing good about the suffering, the death, the trauma that scarred 2 generations. What was good, if anything can be called good in the context of war, was that men rose to meet the challenge, that they did what had to be done despite the cost, that they maintained their humanity in circumstances designed to strip away humanity. The Marine who helped a wounded Japanese soldier, knowing that soldier might have killed his friends, demonstrated moral courage as real as physical courage. The corpsman who worked on enemy wounded as well as American wounded, adhering to his medical oath despite the hatred and fear around him, showed the best of what humans can be. These 5 battles, Tenaru, EDSON'S Ridge, Bougainville, SAIPAN, PELELIU, span from August 1942 to September 1944, 25 months of a war that would last 4 years in the Pacific. They represent the learning curve of amphibious warfare, the terrible education in how to fight an enemy that would not surrender, the human cost of pursuing absolute victory. The Marines who fought these battles were not a different species of humanity. They were us, ordinary people placed in extraordinary circumstances. That's simultaneously comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it means that courage and sacrifice are not limited to some special class of heroes but are capacities all humans possess. Terrifying because it means we are all capable of the violence and brutality that war demands, that the line between civilization and savagery is thinner than we like to believe. The survivors of these battles, those who made it home, who lived into old age, carried their experiences quietly. At reunions, they could talk with each other about what happened, could speak freely about the fear and the exhaustion and the confusion of combat, could mention the names of friends who didn't come home. But with outsiders, even with family, they remained largely silent. The experience was too intense, too foreign to civilian life, too traumatic to discuss casually. Better to stay silent, to remember privately, to live with the ghosts. Most are gone now, the last veterans of World War II dying at a rate of hundreds per day as age catches up with them. Soon there will be no living memory of these battles, just the historical record and the stories passed down. That makes it more important than ever to tell these stories accurately and completely, to ensure that future generations understand not just the strategic importance of these battles but the human reality of them. If you've listened this far, you've invested nearly 2 hours in understanding 5 battles that most Americans couldn't locate on a map and whose importance might not be immediately apparent. But these battles matter. They matter because they represent the price of the freedom we enjoy today. The world where Axis powers won World War II would be a nightmare. Nazi Germany controlling Europe, Imperial Japan controlling Asia and the Pacific, fascism triumphant. That didn't happen because men fought and died on islands like Guadalcanal and PELELIU and SAIPAN. The price was terrible, but the alternative was worse. Think about which of these 5 battles you found most remarkable. Was it Tenaru, where Americans faced a suicidal night assault and learned for the first time that Japanese soldiers would literally die to the last man? Was it EDSON'S Ridge, where a few hundred Marines held against thousands of attackers for 2 nights of continuous combat? Was it Bougainville, where one sergeant decided to charge a fortified position alone because it was the only way to save the landing? Was it SAIPAN, where Sergeant Baker insisted on being left behind with 8 bullets and killed 13 enemy soldiers before he died? Was it PELELIU, where Captain Pope's company fought with rocks and bare hands when they ran out of ammunition? Each battle has its own character, its own lessons, its own heroes whose names should be remembered. Share this story with anyone who wants to understand military history, who has family members who served, who wonders what courage really looks like when tested to the absolute limit. Leave a comment about which battle affected you most profoundly. Talk to the veterans in your life while you still can, and if they're willing to share their stories, listen with respect and gratitude. Visit the military cemeteries where thousands lie buried. Read the names on the headstones. Understand that each name represents a universe of experiences and relationships and potential that was cut short. The most insane Marine Corps moves of World War II weren't insane at all. They were rational responses to impossible situations by men who refused to quit. They were ordinary men doing extraordinary things because the mission demanded it and their brothers needed them. They were the price of victory in a war that had to be won. We owe them a debt that cannot be repaid, only remembered and honored. Semper Fidelis, always faithful. That's the Marine Corps motto, and it captures what these 5 battles demonstrated. Faith to the mission, faith to each other, faith that doing the right thing matters even when the cost is everything. The Marines who fought at Tenaru and EDSON'S Ridge and Bougainville and SAIPAN and PELELIU kept that faith. The least we can do is remember them and tell their stories so that future generations understand what they did and why it mattered. Their courage purchased the world we live in today. That's a debt we can never fully repay, but we can acknowledge it, honor it, and strive to be worthy of their sacrifice.